There are moments in life when everything changes, not because of a loud warning or a dramatic event, but because someone notices something small that does not quite belong. On an ordinary afternoon, in a place most people passed every day without a second thought, a quiet sentence stopped a room full of grown men in their tracks. A child looked up and said there was something up there that should not be there. No shouting followed, no panic, just silence. The kind of silence that asks a question most adults forget to ask. What if we have been missing what is right in front of us? This is not a story about crime or confrontation. It is a story about attention, about what happens when people choose to listen instead of dismiss, and about how truth sometimes enters a room through the smallest voice. Emily Carter was 10 years old enough to run fast, old enough to ask questions, and young enough to see the world without assumptions. She spent most afternoons at Hawthorne Park, a familiar patch of grass and concrete tucked between quiet streets and aging storefronts. To Emily, the park was not just a place to play, it was a pattern. The way the trees leaned, the way shadows stretched across the pavement. She noticed things. Her father, Mark Carter, often said she had a habit of looking twice when everyone else looked once. That afternoon felt like any other. The air was warm, the grass freshly cut, the sound of laughter drifting across the park. A ball rolled too far, bounced once, then disappeared through the open bay doors of a nearby garage. Most children would have shrugged and let it go. Emily did not. She followed it. The garage belonged to the Redwood Riders, a local motorcycle club that had been there longer than most people could remember. Inside, the space was clean and orderly, motorcycles lined up with care. Tools hung where they belonged. The smell of oil and coffee lingered in the air. It was a place built by hands that valued work and routine. Emily felt the shift immediately. Not fear, just awareness. She retrieved the ball and turned to leave. That was when she looked up. She did not know what she was looking for. She only knew something felt off. A patch near the ceiling beam looked cleaner than the rest, as if it had been touched recently, while everything around it had been left alone. Emily stopped, tilted her head, and said out loud that something up there did not belong. The men in the garage did not laugh. They did not brush her aside. Jack Miller, who had led the Redwood Riders for years, raised his eyes and followed her gaze. Others did the same. What they saw did not alarm them immediately, but it concerned them enough to pause. Concern is different from fear. It invites questions instead of reactions. They checked carefully, slowly, responsively. What they found raised concerns, not conclusions. Something had been placed where it should not have been. No accusations were made, no assumptions spoken. Instead, Jack made a decision that would shape everything that followed. He called Emily's father. Mark Carter arrived quietly. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He looked, examined, and confirmed what needed further review. Nothing more, nothing less. In that moment, the story could have gone in many directions. Instead, it went in the only direction that mattered, toward responsibility. Emily watched the adults around her change in small ways. They stood closer together. They spoke more carefully. And for the first time, she realized that noticing something did not make her a hero. It made her a witness, and the people around her chose to listen. That choice made all the difference. When Mark Carter stepped into the Redwood Riders' garage that afternoon, he did not come as a father ready to scold, and he did not come as a man looking for trouble. He came as someone who had spent his life working with his hands, fixing what others overlooked, and learning that most problems grow worse when people rush to name them too quickly. Mark was not the kind of man who filled a room with words. He listened first. He looked second, and only then did he speak. That habit had kept him employed for decades, wiring homes, repairing aging systems, and solving quiet problems before they became expensive ones. It was also the reason Jack Miller trusted him. Jack watched carefully as Mark examined the area near the ceiling beam. There was no dramatic reaction, no sharp intake of breath, just a long pause, followed by a slow nod. Mark did not say what it was or who might have placed it there. He simply said that it did not appear to belong to the garage and that it raised concerns that deserved a closer look. That choice of words mattered. Concerns invite process. Accusations invite conflict. Jack understood the difference. He had spent most of his adult life learning when to speak and when to wait. As the leader of the Redwood Riders, he had seen what happened when people reacted out of pride instead of patience. This time, he chose patience. The garage shifted that evening, not in noise, but in tone. Tools were put away. Conversations softened. The men did not treat the situation as a threat. They treated it as a responsibility. Whatever had been found would be addressed the right way, with clarity and care. Emily noticed the change, even if she did not fully understand it. She saw the way her father's shoulders stayed relaxed, the way Jack spoke slower than usual, the way no one raised their voice. She had expected trouble. Instead, she saw something else entirely: trust. Mark explained to Emily later that night that noticing something unusual did not mean jumping to conclusions. He told her that in his line of work, the worst mistakes came from assuming you already knew the answer. What mattered was asking the right questions and letting facts take their time. Over the next few days, those questions grew, not loudly, quietly. Information was checked, records were reviewed. The Redwood Riders cooperated fully with a formal review process, offering access instead of resistance. They had nothing to hide, and they knew transparency was their strongest protection. As patterns emerged, they did not point fingers. They noticed inconsistencies, paperwork that did not align, storage arrangements that felt unnecessary, data trails that suggested oversight rather than coincidence. Still, no one used words like scheme or setup. Those words belonged to conclusions, and conclusions had not yet been earned. Jack often stood back during those conversations, listening more than speaking. When he did speak, it was to remind everyone of one thing. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about protecting what mattered: the garage, the park, the sense of community built slowly over years of shared work and quiet loyalty. Emily's role remained small but meaningful. She was present, not in charge, observant, not responsible. When she asked questions, adults answered them honestly, without turning her into something she was not. She was not a hero. She was a child who had noticed something and had been taken seriously. For Mark, that was the part that stayed with him. Not the device, not the paperwork, but the moment when his daughter realized that grown people could choose to listen instead of dismiss. That lesson, he knew, would stay with her longer than any explanation he could offer. Sometimes the most important act is not action, but restraint. The Redwood Riders understood that now. They were not reacting to a threat. They were standing up for a principle. And that decision, made quietly and without spectacle, set the stage for everything that would follow. As the days passed, the situation around the Redwood Riders' garage did not explode into chaos. It settled into something quieter and more deliberate. Mark Carter continued his work, tracing details the way he always had, not to accuse, but to understand. What emerged was not a single alarming discovery, but a collection of small irregularities that, when viewed together, began to form a picture that did not quite make sense.
It started with paperwork that felt unnecessary, storage arrangements that appeared formal on the surface yet lacked the usual logic behind them, delivery references that followed an older format no longer common in recent years. None of it proved wrongdoing, but together these details suggested intention rather than accident. Mark did not use dramatic language when he shared his observations. He said only that the patterns raised questions that deserved careful review.
Jack Miller understood what that meant. In his experience, the most serious problems did not announce themselves loudly. They revealed themselves slowly, through inconsistencies that refused to disappear. Jack made sure that every step taken by the club followed proper channels. Records were shared, access was granted, no doors were closed. Transparency became a shield rather than a risk. During this time, a name surfaced quietly: Richard Nolan, a businessman with interests in redevelopment projects around the neighborhood. His connection to the situation was not framed as guilt, but as relevance. There were overlapping timelines, shared addresses, business entities that intersected with areas under discussion. Jack did not react with anger when the name was mentioned. Instead, he leaned back and reflected on something older than the current situation: how often change arrived wearing the language of improvement while overlooking the people already there. Emily observed all of this from the edges. She did not sit at tables or join conversations meant for adults. She listened. She noticed when explanations changed tone. She watched how her father paused before answering certain questions, and how Jack weighed his words with care. To her, it felt like assembling a puzzle without forcing pieces into place. Some connections fit, others waited. What mattered most was how the adults handled uncertainty. No one rushed to tell a story that could not yet be supported. No one needed a villain to feel righteous. The goal remained steady: protect the truth, protect the community, let facts speak when they were ready. When the situation reached a point that required public review, the Redwood Riders did not hesitate. They welcomed it. For Jack, this was never about defending an image. It was about defending a space that served a purpose beyond motorcycles. The garage had been a place where people learned skills, shared responsibility, and showed up when it mattered. That history deserved honesty, not spectacle. The review process unfolded without shouting or headlines. Information was presented. Timelines were clarified. Observations were documented. It became clear that the concerns were not imagined, nor were they the result of misunderstanding. Something had been arranged to appear legitimate, while quietly suggesting misconduct that did not exist. The implication was serious, but the response remained measured. Emily attended one meeting with her father and Jack. She sat quietly, her feet not quite touching the floor. When she was asked a simple question, she answered plainly. She said she noticed something that did not match the rest of the room. She said she pointed it out. That was all. No embellishment, no heroics. The room shifted when she spoke, not because of emotion, but because of clarity. Sometimes truth arrives without explanation. It simply stands there, waiting to be acknowledged. For Mark, that moment confirmed something he had believed for years. Integrity is not proven by how loudly you speak, but by how carefully you listen. For Jack, it reinforced a lesson learned long ago. Strength does not come from reacting first. It comes from holding steady when others expect noise. By the time the review concluded, the narrative had changed. Not because someone forced it to change, but because the facts made it unavoidable. What remained was not a victory, but a responsibility fulfilled. The Redwood Riders had not defended themselves with anger. They had done so with patience. And Emily learned something she would carry forward: that noticing something small can matter,
not because it makes you important, but because it gives others the chance to do the right thing. When everything settled, there was no loud celebration, no speeches filled with victory, no moment that demanded applause. The Redwood Riders' garage looked much the same as it always had. The same concrete floor, the same worn workbenches, the same steady rhythm of people showing up and doing what needed to be done. But something had shifted beneath the surface. The concerns that once hovered quietly over the space had been addressed through proper review and open process. The questions that needed answers had received them. Not all outcomes were immediate, and not every thread led to a neat conclusion, but the truth no longer hid in shadows. It had been given room to stand in the open, where it belonged.
Jack Miller returned to his routines without ceremony. He wiped his hands on a rag, leaned over engines, and listened more than he spoke. To anyone watching from the outside, nothing dramatic had changed. But to those who understood the weight of what had almost been lost, the difference was clear. The garage was not just a building, it was a place where people learned accountability, where mistakes were fixed instead of buried, and where loyalty meant telling the truth even when it was uncomfortable. Mark Carter felt a quieter change, one that followed him home. He noticed how Emily asked questions differently now, not louder, not with urgency, but with confidence. She had seen adults handle uncertainty without fear, and that image stayed with her. He knew she would remember that lesson far longer than the details of what had been found or reviewed. Emily did not become a symbol or a headline. She went back to school, back to the park, back to drawing shapes and ideas in notebooks. But she carried something new with her, an understanding that paying attention mattered, that speaking up could be simple, and that when people listened, small observations could protect something larger. The community around Hawthorne Park felt the shift as well. It was subtle, a nod of recognition, a longer pause before judgment. People remembered that the Redwood Riders had chosen transparency over defensiveness, that they had welcomed review instead of resisting it. In a world often driven by reaction, restraint stood out. This story was never about exposing wrongdoing for its own sake. It was about responsibility, about choosing process over panic, about adults setting an example not through authority, but through conduct. That is the kind of strength that lasts, especially in the eyes of those still learning what integrity looks like. As time moved on, the garage remained a place of work and quiet connection. People came and went. Engines were fixed. Conversations unfolded without urgency. And occasionally, someone would look up at the ceiling beams and smile, remembering that paying attention had once protected something worth keeping. For those listening now, there is a simple question worth sitting with. How many times have we overlooked something small because it did not demand our attention loudly enough? And how different might things be if we slowed down and looked again? If you have ever noticed something that others missed, or chosen to listen when it would have been easier to dismiss, your story matters. Share it. Talk about it. These moments rarely make headlines, but they shape communities all the same. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stayed with you, consider sharing it with someone who values honesty and quiet courage. And if you would like to hear more stories about people who chose integrity over impulse, we invite you to stay with us and join the journey forward.